Welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone watching from NA, I'm assuming around morning time. Welcome to everyone watching from EU, right about afternoon, and to the 17 people I counted watching from Asia, good evening. Today is Raid Buff Wednesday. What do I mean by Raid Buff Wednesday? Well, I mean, it's time to start counting. It's time to start counting how many things the specs and classes in Dragonflight will have, which might very well give you a guaranteed spot in the raid, because in case you haven't kept track, Dragonflight will be adding a significant amount of raid buffs and a significant amount of party buffs. So things you want in your raid, things you want in your party, you know, powerful increases to your damage, your healing, your defensive ability, etc, etc, which will make your raid leader want particular classes or particular specs be part of the raid. This video started being thought of when I saw the new couple of additions given to the general tree of Monk. Why? Because Monk has these two things added to the tree, which they look small, they look tiny, and also rather uninteresting, but they can have a significant power, downright to being almost mandatory in the raid. This is of course quite confusing because Monk already has this. Monk already has Mystic Touch. Monk is already required in your raid because you want to be doing 5% more physical damage. So the cozy and comfy spot of a Monk in a raid is already guaranteed by this passive ability alone. Yet Monk got a couple new things that made me wonder about this whole requirements of specs and classes, because this leech for the Monk being raid-wide, being to everyone, leech heals very little. It heals very often, but for very little, which makes the overheal of leech pretty much the smallest amount of overheal of any healing spell, so it's very, very small. And, you know, with just 2 points, this would be the healing of a Monk in a fight, in a raid fight. I think this is Sylvanas or Fate Scribe. This is the healing that you would have as a Monk if you spent 2 talent points in this 4% leech. Or another fight, this would be the leech healing that a Monk would have if you spent 2 points in this talent. Obviously, this is like a catastrophic scenario. As you have read, the buff of the leech is just 10 yards. So, you know, you're not going to be fighting the entire time a raid boss, always with all the raid stacked in 10 yards, obviously. So this is not going to be what it is, but it makes it an extremely powerful buff for just 2 talent points to give to a Monk, for example. And this is, to repeat, given to a class that already has Mystic Touch, already has a mandatory raid spot because of the physical damage buff. Same type of buff is also going to give a Demon Hunter a comfy spot in the raid because they have Chaos Brand. So the 5% magical damage power, they also have it for a spot in the raid. Also in Dragonflight, not only Demon Hunters for DPS, for Havoc Demon Hunter will have access to Darkness, which is a decent raid cooldown. It's not, you know, it's not mandatory, okay? We're not claiming that Demon Hunters are brought to the raid because they have Darkness, but it helps. Now, Vengeance Demon Hunters, so the tanks can also use Darkness as well. Druids is another entry to the mandatory pick of Dragonflight, because up to now, up to Shadowlands, Druids only have Innervate. You know, Innervate is not bad, but again, it's not mandatory. It's not absolutely 100% needed. It's just an extra help for your healers. What makes them mandatory in Dragonflight is the new baseline ability given to them, which is Mark of the Wild. Mark of the Wild gives you 3% speed to all your raid, which is okay, but more importantly, it gives you 3% critical strike chance and 2% less magical damage taken. This is of course completely broken. It should not exist whatsoever, as a buff is way too powerful. You know, back to the examples, this would be the damage, almost like a tank, the damage that you would do as a druid just by clicking Mark of the Wild in the raid, just by giving everyone 3% more crit. And I'm not even counting the healing that you would give your healers by giving them 3% more crit, and I'm not even counting the 2% damage reduction for magical damage that you will give all of your raiders if you have Mark of the Wild. So Druid also joins the group, joins the gang of the classes that will be a must in Dragonflight. There is of course an extra class that will join the must pick of Dragonflight, obviously, is the hero class, is the Evoker. Blizzard of course planning a new class, they certainly cannot make it come out on release to be the weakest of the classes, obviously, and they also must make them playable and popular, obviously, which makes them have quite a few good amounts of special things. Number one, of course, they are given Bloodlust. So now, on top of mages and shamans and then hunters with their pets, now also evokers have access to Bloodlust. They already have been given a baseline raid buff, which I don't believe it's mandatory. I don't think this would make you a must pick in the raid. It is certainly useful. It's probably at the same level of darkness of a demon hunter, or AMZ of a death knight, getting your movement abilities to have 15% less cooldown. It's okay, but not mandatory. What starts to get a little bit more serious is Zephyr. Zephyr is not gonna be mandatory just because it's only for your party. If it was for your raid, to reduce the damage taken from AoE attacks by 20% and giving you 30% move speed, it would be mandatory for the raid, but because it affects only the party, then okay, fine, it's still not a mandatory class. What very likely will make Evoker join the gang of the mandatory classes for Dragonflight is Time Spiral. Bend time, allowing you and your allies to cast their major movement ability once in the next 10 seconds, even if it is on cooldown. So this is what will likely make Evoker one of the mandatory classes to bring in a raid in Dragonflight. We have then a barrage of our usual suspects making it into the raid. We have Arcane Intellect, so intellect buff for mages. We have Devotion Aura, so the 3% damage reduction given to paladins. That's also gonna make it in the mandatory spots for your raid. You have Fortitude for priest. Stamina, also making it in the mandatory picks for your raid. Priest, however, is a little bit higher than just Fortitude, because Priest, as you know, also has Power Infusion. Power Infusion, as you know, is also making it in Dragonflight, so that makes them even more valuable. Priest, unlike, for example, something like Mage, is one of the classes that can start justifying bringing more than one. Because once you bring one Paladin, they have one Devotion Aura, that's it. Once you bring one Mage, they have Arcane Intellect, that's done. Once you bring a Priest, they give you Fortitude, they give you Stamina, but they can also give you Power Infusion. If you bring 2 Priests, that's 2 Power Infusions. If you bring 5 Priests, that's 5 Power Infusions. So that's one of the classes that not only has a mandatory raid buff, but also has a very powerful buff that is still useful if you bring more of them. Back to one of those one-of type of picks for mandatory choices is Warlock. Warlock has always been very unique. They don't have a raid buff, they don't have a particularly strong raid debuff or a mega cooldown to give to your raid, but they have Hellstones, which is extremely unique and nobody else has access to. That alone already makes them a mandatory pick in the raid. If that wasn't enough, they also have Demonic Gateway for your movement. That alone would also make them mandatory in the raid, and they also have Soulstone, which is in some cases the best version of a combat res, because you can already put it on someone. So especially when you expect someone to die, this is by far the best version of a combat res. Usually this is the better one for tanks, right? When tanks expect to be dying from something, they can insta-rest with Soulstone. It's a much better version of a combat rest. If that wasn't enough, talking about the almost mandatory category, they have some very useful things like Curse of Tongues to slow the cast of the enemies by 30%, and Curse of Weakness to slow the attacks of the enemies by 20%, which also makes it very, very useful. We are back to talking about a new category of class making it into the raid as a mandatory pick. This class has gone in and out depending on what they had in the past. Before, they had a few things like, for example, Smoke Bomb, which was working as a raid defensive, which made them join the raid as a mandatory pick. In the last few years, however, Rogue has lagged behind a little bit. They have lost their raid cooldowns, they have lost their powers. Also, the boss fights started to be developed to have way fewer mechanics that can be cheesed by Cheat Death or cheesed by Cloak of Shadows. So since Legion, Rogue has lost a lot of its, flavor of the month meta state in the raid. However, in Dragonflight, they get not one but 2 things that might make them a must pick. One, it's the more debatable one because it's about power and it's about just your party, Restless Crew. Restless Blades also affects party members within 40 yards, reducing the remaining cooldown of a major offensive ability by 0.2 seconds per combo point spent. So the TLDR is that more or less whenever an outlaw rogue uses a finisher, you get 1 second off of your main cooldown if you are in the party of the rogue. That's one that, depending on the tuning, depending on the sims and whatnot, might also make Outlaw basically a mandatory pick in the raid. What is certainly going to be a mandatory pick, surprisingly, is Assassination Rogue, because Assassination Rogue has been given Atrophic Poison. Atrophic Poison gives each attack of the rogue a 10% chance to poison the enemy, reducing the damage they deal by 3% for 10 seconds. This is the same as Devotion Aura. Not only that, but this can become better than Devotion Aura if you take, in the general Rogue 3, Master Poisoner, increasing the effect of your non-combat poisons by 20%, making this 3% damage reduction a 3.6% damage reduction, which makes it a mandatory pick in your raid. And we then finish with the last of the raid buffs, one of the oldest raid buffs in the game, Battle Shout. Your attack power increase from warriors. Warriors also still have Rallying Cry, which is one of the better/best raid cooldowns from non-healers you can have in a raid. That alone, I'm thinking that alone, even without Battle Shout, might have made at least one warrior a mandatory pick in the raid anyways. Now they even have something else. Not protection, just arms or fury, but now they also have access to Skull Banner, which is going to be a very powerful crit damage, burst window increase that you can use for your party in Dragonflight. Now, once we are done listing all of the things that will be mandatory in the raid, we are left with the question, okay, what about the ones we have not mentioned? Because we haven't mentioned, if you kept track, we haven't mentioned Death Knight, we haven't mentioned Hunter, and we haven't mentioned Shaman. So Death Knight is in the almost mandatory category. Death Knight has Anti-Magic Zone, also has the usefulness of Anti-Magic Shell, which can cheese some mechanics. They also have Death Grip, that can also be used very often. It will be one of your main strategies when dealing with adds. Controlling the adds, Death Grip is like the best tool. It also gets better in Dragonflight. Not only do you still have the Death Reach talent to reset its cooldown and making it more usable, but you also have Death's Echo to give you 2 charges of Death Grip to make it even better. Hunters, on the other hand, have basically nothing. They have no special thing to bring to the raid. And then Shamans, the only pseudo possible mandatory pick is in enhancement with Wind Fury Totem. The rest of the Shaman picks are a myriad of tiny little utility pieces that maybe if you stack them up all together, they are going to equal the value of a proper buff, but not really. You have things like Stone Skin Totem to give you 10% less physical damage reduction to your party. You have Tranquil Air Totem to stop knockbacks in your party. You have both Mana Spring and Mana Tide Totem for mana regeneration. You have Tremor Totem to cancel out fears and charms and sleeps. You have Windrush Totem for movement. You have the shortest interrupt in the game and still by far the best interrupt of all of the healers. You have the Offensive Dispel in Purge. A whole list of things that are not really, any of them, not really mandatory, but might make it in your raid composition, maybe. And when you look at this, our raid composition, you are stuck with a problem. Because if we go back to what we just said, okay, Monk makes it because of the debuff, Rogue makes it because of the buff, you also have Druid, with the new buff, you have Demon Hunter with the debuff, you have Warlocks and their myriad of useful things, you have Priest with their stamina buff, you have Paladin with Devotion Aura coming in, you have Mage with their Intellect buff, you have Warriors with their Battle Shout buff, you have Death Knights, which are not must-have, but near must-have, really. And then we have also the invisible Evokers that are not really here, but let's just pretend this is Evoker, which will become a must-pick. When you have all of this in front of you, you're left with Shaman, which is, maybe, perhaps, if the fight has the proper required utility that Shaman has, maybe that can be useful, and then you have Hunters. It's not a good picture for your classes to be like this, because it becomes even worse when you lay this down instead of classes with specs. Once you fill this up with all of the specs that bring something different, like the 2 different rogue specs and their 2 different buffs they can bring, the Battle Shout, the Mark of the Wild, your Warlock Staff, your Fortitude, your Wind Fury Totem, the Demon Hunter debuff and the Monk debuff, Arcane Intellect, Devotion, Aura, your Death Knight and a bunch of useful things they can bring, and our Evoker here that's missing, that's 13 specs. That is 13 mandatory specs in your raid out of 20. And it can start to clog the variety, the options that you have in your raid. For example, the moment you need Death Knight as a tank and your debuff of the Monk is brought by Brewmaster, you have already cucked yourself out of any other chance to bring different tanks, for example. The situation can get even worse. Imagine a scenario where, fine, Druid, we still need the Mark of the Wild, so we bring a Druid tank instead of a balanced Druid. We also need Devotion Aura. So, we don't need a Holy Paladin, we can just bring a Prot Paladin instead of a Blood Death Knight. But we still want the good utility of a Death Knight, so we still bring an Unholy in. We still need the debuff of a Monk, now that we got rid of a Brewmaster, so we bring a Windwalker in. The result is that now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 melee DPS locked in your raid group. 7. 7 is already considered a lot right now, and this would be mandatory picks for your composition. What if there is a boss where you only want 5 melee, or you only want 4 melee? What about the melees that have been left out? What about Frost? What about Retribution? What about Survival? What about Fury? What about all of these specs if these 7 are going to be mandatory? That is the main problem I have been having when looking at all of these mandatory things being brought out by Blizzard. At first it looks okay, because you start seeing new classes with new things, so you're happy. Okay, you're happy that finally Druid is a mandatory pick, so now maybe you can find more spots for specs like Restoration Druid or Feral Druid even. You're also okay that things like Assassination Rogues or Outlaw Rogues that never really had in recent years mandatory things are also making it into your composition. It's nice that Shaman in particular enhancement was given something like Wind Fury that can be considered mandatory in certain situations. However, if you stop and you don't give every spec something mandatory, then it becomes a problem. Because then how do you justify bringing Elemental in any case, in any situation? How do you justify bringing the only, at this point, healer left out with any mandatory thing, which is Shaman? Holy Paladin is going to have Devotion Aura, Mystery Monk is going to have the debuff and what we mentioned, the 4% leech or even the 4% avoidance. We have Resto Druid with Mark of the Wild. We have talked about the new things the new Evoker is going to be able to bring. Priest still has stamina, Priest still has power infusion, so Shaman is left out. And the same can be said for a whole bunch of other classes and specs. Some problematic things like giving a raid debuff to Assassination, very powerful, giving a potentially powerful party buff to Outlaw, but give nothing to Subtlety. When is Subtlety ever going to make it in, if Assassination and Outlaw are basically going to be mandatory? That is sort of my main problem, it gets kind of problematic. I also have been not a fan of the state of tanks, because tanks in recent years have been used as a plug. They have been used to round up the remaining buffs or debuffs you need in the raid. This is why, for example, Brewmaster has been a standout pick in the raid for so many years. Not because they are insane raid tanks, but because Mistweaver and Windwalker have been so bad, or so just average, so not exciting in the raid, that you can just not worry about the raid debuff they bring and simply bring a Brewmaster Monk. Same problem with Prot Paladin. Prot Paladin brings absolutely nothing to the raid other than Devotion Aura, but Paladin Healer has been so powerful that there is no need to bring a Protection Paladin. Exact same problem with Druid. Guardian Druid brings absolutely nothing to the raid, so why would we bring a Guardian Druid? Next expansion you have Mark of the Wild, so you have a reason to bring a Guardian Druid, but there is still the problem. If you bring Guardian Druid to give you Mark of the Wild, what is the purpose of Feral? What is the purpose of Resto Druid if they don't have top healing qualities, or Balanced Druid as well? That, to close, is my problem with the buffs and raid debuffs and party buffs and whatnot that we have seen so far in the Dragonflight Alpha and Beta. I don't like that only certain specs have been given this treatment. Blizzard has talked about how they want to give more things, more options and more variety, which is good. However, it only becomes good if you actually give everyone not equal, okay? I'm not hoping in this utopian world where everyone is exactly on the same level, but at the very least everyone is giving a chance to be useful, a possibility to be used and to be valuable. What we have seen so far is that we do have a handful of specs that definitely are not on the same level of certain other specs when it comes to the powers they can bring to the raid, or in some cases even to Mythic Plus. So this was the point of concern for today. The discrepancy, the differences, the inequality in the powerful things that might make your spec needed in the raid of the next expansion. Hoping that it might get better in the near future before Dragonflight gets released and we enter this issue right here. The issue where your raid leader is making the comp, and once he's done picking all the raid buffs, all the raid debuffs, party buffs and whatnot, he is left with only 6 or 7 slots available and everything else is just taken by mandatory picks. That's what I don't want to see happen in Dragonflight. So let me guys know what you think about this potential issue. Maybe you don't give a shit because you play a mage, so who cares? You have your arcane intellect, whatever. But maybe you have more concerns about this potential issue flaring up in Dragonflight. As always, thanks everyone for all the support on my Patreon, for allowing me to continue to produce WoW content as we delve deeper into the beta of Dragonflight. As usual, in case you were worried, no, I am still the CEO and chairman of the No Alpha Committee. I have just been promoted to the president of the No Beta company. For now, that's how it is. You can support even more by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, together with following me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right down at these 2 links. Thank you guys again for watching. As usual, we will see each other very likely tomorrow. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, just move some of these buffs around. You know, this Leech and Avoidance, instead of giving it to Monk, you could give it to Hunter, or you could give it to Shaman to make them more wanted in the raid, for example. Just give everyone a chance, okay?